December nights are cold, but these stories will make them even colder. Get ready for tales that will keep you awake long after the snow stops falling. Before we begin, subscribe and share this video with someone who loves a good scare. Let's get into it. The snowstorm had settled over the small town of White Pines, Minnesota, blanketing everything in a thick, icy hush. Emma and Michael were bundled up inside their cozy log cabin at the edge of the woods, the crackling fireplace casting a warm, golden glow across the room. The smell of hot cocoa mingled with the faint scent of pine, and soft jazz played on the old record player. It was a perfect December evening, just the two of them, escaping the chaos of the holidays. "It's almost too perfect," Emma said with a laugh, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Michael grinned, leaning back in the armchair with a mug of cocoa in hand. "Nothing like a storm to make you appreciate being indoors." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the couple paid it no mind. The cabin was a safe haven, tucked away from the world. Or so they thought. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Both of them froze. Michael set his mug down on the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Who would come out in this storm?" Emma whispered, her voice tight with unease. Michael stood and grabbed his phone. "Maybe someone's stranded. I'll check." He approached the door cautiously, glancing back at Emma before peeking through the peephole. "Kids?" he muttered, confused. "What?" Emma joined him, her brow furrowing. Outside, two children stood on the porch, shivering in the snow. A boy and a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. Their clothes were thin, completely inappropriate for the freezing weather. Their heads were bowed, and their hair hung limply, plastered to their pale faces. "They must be lost," Michael said, unlocking the door and opening it a crack. The cold air rushed in, sharp and biting. The children didn't lift their heads, didn't speak. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice softening. The boy was the first to move. He raised his head slowly, and when Michael saw his face, he took an involuntary step back. The boy's eyes were pitch black. No whites, no pupils. Just endless voids that seemed to absorb the light. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" The girl raised her head next, revealing the same empty, soulless eyes. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was cold, calculated. "Can we come in?" the boy asked. His voice was flat, emotionless, almost robotic. Michael hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to shut the door. But it was freezing outside, and they were just kids, weren't they? "Where are your parents?" Emma asked, stepping closer. "They're coming," the girl replied softly, tilting her head. Her voice was like a distant echo, unsettling in its monotone. Michael tightened his grip on the doorframe. "I think you should wait for them outside," he said firmly. "We can call for help if you need it." The boy took a step forward, his movements jerky, almost unnatural. "We need to come in," he insisted. Emma tugged on Michael's arm. "Close the door," she whispered urgently. Michael hesitated a moment longer, then slammed the door shut, locking it. The knocking resumed almost immediately, slow, steady. The sound reverberated through the cabin, far louder than it should have been. Michael backed away from the door, his heart hammering. "They're just kids," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Emma shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Michael, those aren't kids. Did you see their eyes?" The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. Silence. For a moment, neither of them moved, listening intently. Then came the whispers. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. They weren't coming from the door. They were all around them. "Let us in," the girl's voice said, almost sing-song. "You can't keep us out," the boy added, his tone colder. The windows rattled and the lights flickered. Emma grabbed Michael's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know, but we're not opening that door." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they filled the cabin like a storm. The fire in the hearth sputtered, the shadows on the walls twisting unnaturally. Panicked, Emma grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" a calm voice asked. "There are children outside our cabin," Emma blurted out. They're not normal. They have black eyes and they're trying to get in." The operator paused for a beat. "Officers are on their way. Stay inside and lock all doors and windows." The minutes stretched into an eternity until the sound of a siren cut through the howling wind. Red and blue lights illuminated the swirling snow as two officers banged on the door. Michael flung it open. "They're out there," he shouted. "The kids! Look for the kids!" The officers swept the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But when they returned, their expressions were confused. "There's no one out here," one of them said. Michael and Emma exchanged horrified glances. "They were just here," Emma insisted. The officers did a thorough sweep of the cabin and the surrounding area. "No signs of anyone," the other officer confirmed. "Could have been the storm playing tricks on you." As the patrol car disappeared down the snowy road, the couple sat in tense silence, the weight of the officer's disbelief heavy in the air. Then came a loud crash from the back of the cabin. Michael grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "Are you crazy? I'm not staying here alone." Emma clung to him as they moved toward the back room. The windows in the bedroom were fogged up with frost, but the faint shapes of two figures could be seen pressed against the glass. "They're everywhere," Emma whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady. They echoed through the cabin, but they couldn't tell where they were coming from. "Michael," Emma cried softly, pointing to the hallway. The children were inside. They stood in the shadows, their black eyes shining faintly. Behind them, two taller figures appeared, a man and a woman, pale and thin, their movements smooth, but unnatural. "You shouldn't have kept us out," the boy said, his voice deeper than it should have been, almost like it wasn't his. Emma screamed as the figures moved closer, their shapes stretching and twisting like smoke. The last thing Michael saw before the cabin went completely dark was the girl's face. She was smiling, her black eyes pulling him into what felt like an endless void. When the storm cleared the next day, the cabin was eerily quiet. The fireplace was cold, and the front door was still locked from the inside. Neither Michael nor Emma was ever seen again. But sometimes, on snowy December nights, the townsfolk swear they hear it. Soft whispers and the faint sound of footsteps in the snow. It was December 2020, and the world felt like it was ending. COVID-19 had locked down everything, and the isolation was suffocating. I'd been driving through Wyoming, heading toward Jackson Hole. The roads were blanketed with snow, the kind that muted every sound and made the world feel unreal. It was late, around midnight, and the highway was deserted. The occasional snowplow passed in the other direction, its amber lights flashing like a ghost ship on the horizon. The only sound in my car was the hum of the heater and the faint crackle of an old country station I'd tuned into. I had to make this trip. My mom was sick, and though we hadn't spoken much in recent years, something in her voice on the phone, raspy and weak, had torn through my pride. So here I was, driving 12 hours straight to a town that didn't even feel like home anymore. The snow was coming down heavier now, thick flakes swirling like they were alive. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the road signs were coated in ice, their words unreadable. I glanced at the dashboard, 12:47 a.m. As I crested a hill, my high beams caught something up ahead. A car parked on the shoulder with its hazards flashing. "Damn it," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. I didn't want to stop. Not in this weather, not at this time of night. But what if someone was in trouble? I slowed down, my tires crunching on the packed snow, and pulled up behind the car. It was an old sedan, beat up and rusting. The windows were fogged over, and I couldn't see inside. I rolled down my window a crack, the icy wind biting at my face. "Hey, you okay in there?" I called out. No answer. I waited a moment, the heater blowing hot air against my freezing hand. Then I killed the engine, grabbed my flashlight from the glove box, and stepped out into the cold. The snow was blinding, the wind howling like a living thing. My boots crunched as I approached the car. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down, but the inside was dark. "Hello?" I called again, shining the flashlight into the car. But it was empty. The seats were covered in a thin layer of frost, like the car had been abandoned hours ago. The keys dangled from the ignition, and the driver's door was slightly open. That's when I saw the footprints, 2 sets of them, leading away from the car and into the woods on the side of the road. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the snow. "What the hell?" I whispered, my breath fogging up the air. I should have gotten back in my car. I should have called it in and kept driving. But something about those footprints, how small they were, like a child's, made me follow them. I walked to the edge of the woods, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I scanned the trees. The snow muffled everything, but I swear I could hear something faint, a whisper or maybe a laugh. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. I followed the tracks deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with snow. The wind seemed quieter here, but the cold was sharper, biting through my jacket. The footprints stopped abruptly in a small clearing. No sign of where they went, just an expanse of untouched snow. I turned in a slow circle, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. That's when I noticed it. There was something standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. A figure. It was tall and thin, its shape distorted by the swirling snow. It almost looked human, but something was off. The way it stood, motionless, as if it didn't need to breathe or even feel the cold. "Hey!" I called, trying to sound brave even though my voice shook. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the white, like it was part of the forest itself. I took a cautious step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Are you okay?" Then slowly, it tilted its head to the side, the movement sharp and unnatural, like a bird inspecting its prey. My breath hitched. I couldn't make out any features, just an overwhelming sense that it was watching me. That's when it moved. It didn't step forward. It shifted. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, and the next it was halfway closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought it had gone out completely. The figure was closer now, close enough that I could see its outline more clearly. Its limbs were too long, its body impossibly thin, and its head seemed wrong, almost like it was too big for its neck, as though its skull was stretching the skin. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam caught its face, or where its face should have been. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched tight, so thin I could see the faint contours of the bone beneath. It leaned forward slightly, and that's when I saw movement. Tiny ripples in the skin, as though something was crawling just beneath the surface. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Then, it made a sound. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't even a growl. It was a wet, guttural clicking, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of water. The sound echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trees and making my skin crawl. The figure's head twitched, jerking to one side, then the other, as if it was deciding what to do next. That's when it lunged. It didn't run. It didn't walk. It was just there, a blur of motion that shouldn't have been possible. One moment it was 20 feet away, and the next, it was so close I could feel the cold radiating off its skin. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I turned and bolted. The snow clawed at my legs, dragging me down as if the forest itself wanted to keep me there. I could hear it behind me, the crunch of snow, the wet clicking sound growing louder. I tripped, hitting the ground hard, my flashlight skittering away into the darkness. The cold seeped into my clothes, numbing me, but I didn't care. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. Behind me, the clicking turned into a low, guttural whisper. It wasn't speaking words, but the sound was still somehow inside my head, curling around my thoughts and filling me with a bone-deep terror. It was close, too close. I burst out of the woods and onto the highway, gasping for air. My car was still there, its headlights cutting through the storm like a lifeline. I threw myself against the door, fumbling with the handle before finally wrenching it open. The sound behind me stopped. For one horrible moment, I dared to look back. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, its head tilted again, watching me. Its smooth face seemed to shift, the skin rippling as if it were trying to form features, but it never quite managed. The clicking grew louder, filling the air, and I slammed the door shut. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I slammed my foot on the gas, tires spinning on the icy road before they finally caught. I didn't look back again. It was December 14th, 2019, and cold enough to freeze you solid. My college, St. Vincent University in northern Minnesota, was buried under a thick blanket of snow. The campus felt deserted, with most students gone for winter break. Only a few of us were stuck in the dorms, waiting out the storm or a ride home. My roommate Chris and I were killing time in our room that night. We'd planned to watch horror movies, but the Wi-Fi kept cutting out. Typical for this place. The storm outside was howling like some wild animal, and the old building creaked under the weight of the snow. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. Just like that, everything went black, and the heater stopped. The room turned freezing in minutes. "Of course," Chris muttered, waving his phone flashlight around. I grabbed my own flashlight and groaned. "Great. Guess we should check the breaker." Chris wasn't thrilled, but there wasn't much else to do. The breaker box was in the basement, a place neither of us liked. It was always damp and creepy, filled with old junk and weird smells. But if we didn't fix it, we'd freeze before the night was over. We bundled up, grabbed flashlights, and headed into the hallway. It was colder than usual, the wind sneaking through cracks around the windows. Snowflakes had drifted in through a broken pane at the end of the corridor, scattering across the floor. When we got to the basement door, I hesitated. Something about it felt off, like the air itself was heavier. Chris gave me a shove. "Come on, man, let's just get this over with." We headed down the narrow staircase, the steps groaning under our weight. The basement smelled like mildew, and the air was damp and cold. Our flashlight beams danced over forgotten furniture, dusty boxes, and old pipes. The breaker box was in the far corner. Chris held the light while I flipped the switches, but nothing happened. "Well, that's useless," Chris said, his voice echoing in the stillness. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the far end of the basement. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Chris nodded, his flashlight shaking. "Yeah, probably the wind or something." But we both knew that wasn't true. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt, but no response. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear over the sound of our own breathing. Then the footsteps started again. Closer this time. Chris turned the light toward the noise. For a second, we saw it. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, peeking out from behind an old shelf. "Holy crap!" Chris yelped, grabbing my arm. The face disappeared, and the footsteps started up again, faster now, heading right toward us. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted for the stairs. The sound of those footsteps followed us, heavy and relentless. Then came a noise I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. We burst into the hallway, slamming the basement door behind us. Chris shoved a chair against it, his face pale as a sheet. "What the hell was that?" he panted. "I don't know," I said, shaking all over. But it wasn't human. We didn't stick around to find out more. Back in our room, we locked the door, shoved the dresser in front of it, and sat there in the dark, listening. A while later, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Then a voice, low and raspy, came from right outside our door.
"Let me in."
Chris clamped a hand over his mouth to keep from screaming. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The door handle rattled, once, twice. Then it stopped. We sat there in silence, terrified, until the sound of the footsteps faded back down the hall. Neither of us slept that night. When the storm cleared in the morning, we packed up and left. Chris and I never went back to St. Vincent. Later, I heard rumors about the dorm. Stories of a student who disappeared in the 70s, last seen heading to the basement during a storm. They never found him. To this day, I can't stand basements or snowstorms. And every December, I still hear that voice in my dreams.
"Let me in."
That's it for tonight's stories, but the terror doesn't have to end here. Make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who loves horror stories. Until next time, stay warm and watch your back.